Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Part 1: Early Life and Roots. Franklin Pierce's journey began on November 23, 1804, in the modest town of Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Born into a politically active and civic-minded family, Pierce's early environment played a significant role in shaping his future. His father, Benjamin Pierce, was a decorated Revolutionary War veteran who went on to serve as a two-term governor of New Hampshire. Benjamin was known for his strong sense of justice and unwavering commitment to public service, qualities that he passed down to his children. Franklin's mother, Anna Kendrick Pierce, provided the stability and nurturing needed to balance the challenges of a politically engaged household. She instilled in her children the importance of education and morality, a foundation that Franklin carried throughout his life. The Pierce family lived modestly but comfortably on their farm. Franklin, the sixth of 8 children, grew up in a bustling household where hard work and community engagement were daily expectations. The rural setting of Hillsborough offered Pierce a robust sense of connection to the land and the people, fostering an understanding of the struggles of ordinary citizens. From a young age, he was exposed to political discourse as his father often hosted meetings with influential figures. These interactions sparked Franklin's curiosity about governance and the role of leadership in shaping society. Despite the active political environment at home, Pierce's early education was unremarkable. He was often distracted and struggled to excel academically, preferring outdoor activities and social interactions. In 1820, recognizing the potential in their son, Benjamin Pierce sent Franklin to Hancock Academy. This decision marked a turning point, as Pierce began to focus on his studies under the guidance of strict but supportive teachers. By 1824, Pierce enrolled at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, an institution known for its rigorous academic environment and vibrant intellectual culture. Initially, Franklin found himself homesick and academically average. However, he soon gained confidence and excelled in debate, public speaking, and social interactions. These skills would later define his career as a lawyer and politician. It was also at Bowdoin that Pierce formed lifelong friendships with figures such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, who would later document parts of his life, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who inspired Pierce's appreciation for the arts. After graduating from Bowdoin, Pierce began studying law under the mentorship of renowned attorneys in New Hampshire. Legal training in the early 19th century involved practical apprenticeships, and Pierce thrived in this environment. By 1827, he was admitted to the bar and quickly established a successful law practice in Hillsborough. His ability to connect with clients and present compelling arguments earned him recognition in his community. His reputation as a skilled lawyer and rising star set the stage for his eventual entry into politics. At just 24 years old, Pierce's political career began when he was elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives. His natural charisma and ability to navigate political complexities allowed him to rise quickly, earning him the position of Speaker of the House by 1831. During his early years in politics, Pierce became known as a champion of the Democratic Party and an advocate for the working class. His early life and education, steeped in the values of service and leadership, prepared him for the challenges that lay ahead. These formative years gave him the tools to connect with diverse audiences and navigate the turbulent political landscape of antebellum America. This strong foundation, however, also came with expectations that would weigh heavily on him as his career advanced. The seeds of Franklin Pierce's eventual rise to the presidency were sown in his early experiences, though the road ahead would be fraught with personal and political trials. Part 2: Rise to Prominence. Franklin Pierce's political ascent began shortly after his entrance into the New Hampshire House of Representatives at the age of 24. His election in 1829 marked the start of a meteoric rise, as his natural charisma, persuasive speaking abilities, and dedication to his constituents quickly set him apart. During his tenure, Pierce demonstrated an innate ability to navigate the complex world of state politics. His speeches, often tailored to resonate with the concerns of working-class citizens, earned him admiration across party lines. By 1831, his peers elected him as Speaker of the House, a position that cemented his status as one of the most promising young politicians in New Hampshire. Pierce's rapid success in state politics did not go unnoticed. The Democratic Party, which was growing in influence under the leadership of Andrew Jackson, sought candidates who could champion their ideals at the national level. In 1833, Pierce was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing New Hampshire's interests on the national stage. He entered Congress during a period of significant political transformation, as Jacksonian democracy emphasized the power of the common man over elite interests. In Washington, Pierce quickly aligned himself with the Democratic Party's core principles, supporting policies that promoted expansion, state sovereignty, and economic equality. His loyalty to the Jacksonian agenda won him the favor of party leaders, and his eloquence in debates made him a rising star within the Democratic ranks. Despite his youth, Pierce gained a reputation for being both reliable and pragmatic, traits that endeared him to colleagues and voters alike. By 1837, Pierce's achievements in the House earned him a seat in the U.S. Senate, making him one of the youngest senators in American history. His tenure in the Senate was marked by a deepening commitment to the Democratic cause, particularly in defending states' rights and opposing centralized federal authority. However, Pierce's years in the Senate also revealed his reluctance to engage in the most contentious debates of the time, particularly those surrounding slavery. While he supported the party's pro-Southern policies, he often avoided taking strong public stances, a strategy that helped him maintain his appeal across regional lines. During this period, Pierce also began to grapple with the demands of national politics and their impact on his personal life. His wife, Jane Means Appleton Pierce, was deeply unhappy in Washington and struggled with health issues. Jane's discomfort with public life and her growing disdain for politics created tension in their marriage, forcing Pierce to balance his political ambitions with his family's well-being. In 1842, after nearly a decade in national politics, Pierce made the surprising decision to resign from the Senate. Citing a desire to spend more time with his family and focus on his law practice, he returned to New Hampshire. While some viewed this move as a retreat, it was, in fact, a strategic withdrawal. Pierce continued to wield considerable influence within the Democratic Party, serving as a behind-the-scenes figure who worked to unify New Hampshire Democrats during a time of internal strife. By the mid-1840s, Pierce's reputation as a unifying force within the Democratic Party and his ability to navigate political complexities without alienating key constituencies positioned him for future opportunities. Though he had stepped back from public office, his prominence within the party and his unwavering loyalty to democratic ideals ensured that Franklin Pierce's political career was far from over. The skills he honed during these early years, diplomacy, persuasion, and an acute understanding of the political landscape, would later propel him to national prominence in a divided America. Part 3: Marriage and Family. In 1834, Franklin Pierce married Jane Means Appleton, a union that would shape both his personal and political life. Jane, the daughter of Jesse Appleton, a former president of Bowdoin College, came from a well-established New England family. She was deeply religious, reserved, and disinclined toward the social and political activities that accompanied her husband's career. The couple's contrasting personalities created a complex dynamic. Franklin was outgoing, ambitious, and sociable, while Jane preferred a quieter, more private existence. Despite their differences, their marriage was built on mutual respect and affection, though it was also marked by significant challenges. Jane's fragile health was a recurring concern throughout their marriage. She suffered from chronic ailments, which were compounded by frequent bouts of depression. Her distaste for politics and public life further strained her relationship with Franklin's burgeoning career. While she supported his aspirations, Jane often struggled with the demands placed on their family by his public service. Her reluctance to engage in political events sometimes left Franklin to navigate the social and ceremonial aspects of his career alone. The couple's greatest bond was their shared love for their children. Franklin and Jane had 3 sons: Franklin Jr., Frank Robert, and Benjamin, known as Benny. However, their family life was overshadowed by tragedy. Franklin Jr., their firstborn, died just days after birth in 1836. The loss devastated the couple, but they found solace in the birth of Frank Robert in 1839. Tragically, Frank Robert died at the age of 4 from typhus, a devastating blow that deepened Jane's grief and further tested the family's resilience. The birth of their third son, Benny, in 1841 brought renewed hope. Jane devoted much of her energy to raising Benny, and he became the center of their lives. Franklin, despite the demands of his career, prioritized his family whenever possible, cherishing the moments he spent with his wife and son. Yet, the couple's profound losses cast a shadow over their home life, leaving Jane increasingly withdrawn and introspective. Franklin's political career often conflicted with his desire to be a present husband and father. While Jane's discomfort with public life grew, Franklin's reputation as a devoted family man helped soften his image in the eyes of the public. Despite Jane's reluctance, she accompanied him to Washington during his time in the Senate, though she rarely participated in official functions. Her presence was largely symbolic, and she longed for the peace and quiet of their home in New Hampshire. By the time Franklin returned to private life in 1842, he hoped to restore a sense of normalcy to his family. The years spent away from Washington allowed the Pierces to reconnect and focus on their domestic life. Franklin's decision to step back from politics was as much a response to Jane's unhappiness as it was a personal desire for respite. However, the scars left by their losses remained, and their relationship continued to be shaped by grief and the pressures of public expectations. The tragedies endured by Franklin and Jane Pierce would profoundly influence their later years. While their marriage survived, the emotional toll left a lasting impact, coloring their responses to the challenges that lay ahead. Their story reflects the personal sacrifices often required in the pursuit of public service, a theme that would resonate throughout Franklin Pierce's life. Part 4: Withdrawal from politics. In 1842, Franklin Pierce made the unexpected decision to resign from his U.S. Senate seat and step back from national politics. At just 38 years old, he was one of the youngest and most promising Democratic politicians in the country. His departure came as a surprise to many, given his growing influence and reputation as a skilled legislator. However, the decision was deeply personal, influenced by his desire to prioritize his family and escape the increasingly contentious political environment of Washington. Pierce's years in the Senate had been marked by his staunch support for Jacksonian democratic principles, including states' rights, limited federal power, and territorial expansion. However, the pressures of balancing his political ambitions with his personal life had taken a toll. Jane Pierce, deeply unhappy in Washington, found the capital's social and political demands overwhelming. Her health deteriorated during Franklin's Senate years, and her discontent grew with each passing session. Franklin, ever mindful of his wife's well-being, saw the strain their lifestyle placed on her and their young son, Benny. The political climate in Washington during the early 1840s also factored into Pierce's decision. The nation was increasingly divided over issues such as slavery, economic policy, and westward expansion. While Pierce had largely avoided taking controversial stances on slavery, his alignment with pro-Southern Democratic policies made him a polarizing figure in some circles. He was beginning to grow disillusioned with the factionalism and infighting that characterized Congress. Upon his return to New Hampshire, Pierce resumed his legal career with enthusiasm. His practice flourished as he represented prominent clients and took on high-profile cases. The move also allowed him to reconnect with his community, where he was a beloved figure. Pierce remained politically active on a state level, serving as an advisor to the New Hampshire Democratic Party and working behind the scenes to maintain party unity. He played a pivotal role in local campaigns, lending his charisma and organizational skills to Democratic efforts. Although he no longer held elected office, Pierce's influence within the Democratic Party only grew during this period. He became a trusted figure in New Hampshire politics, often mediating disputes between factions and ensuring the party's dominance in the state. His ability to navigate the complex dynamics of local politics kept him relevant and respected among his peers. Pierce also used this time to focus on his personal growth and relationships. He deepened his ties with close friends, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, and sought solace in the simplicity of rural life. The challenges of his political career had often left little room for reflection, but these years offered him an opportunity to recharge and reevaluate his priorities. For Jane, the return to New Hampshire brought a sense of relief. Away from the spotlight, she found some measure of peace, though the couple's shared grief over their earlier losses continued to cast a shadow over their lives. By the late 1840s, Pierce had firmly established himself as both a legal and political leader in New Hampshire. His decision to step away from national politics, far from ending his career, positioned him as a statesman whose loyalty to the Democratic cause never wavered. When the nation called upon his leadership during the Mexican-American War, Pierce's readiness to serve would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his life. This period of withdrawal proved crucial in shaping his later political path, allowing him to build the resilience and connections that would ultimately propel him to the presidency. Part 5: Service in the Mexican-American War. Franklin Pierce's political career might have paused after his resignation from the Senate, but his commitment to public service remained steadfast. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, offered him an opportunity to return to national prominence in a different capacity. Pierce was an ardent supporter of the war, aligning with the Democratic Party's belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to expand its territory across the North American continent. This belief, coupled with his loyalty to the party and a sense of duty, motivated Pierce to volunteer for military service despite having no prior combat experience. In 1847, Pierce was commissioned as a brigadier general in the U.S. Army by President James K. Polk. His appointment was controversial, as critics questioned his qualifications and accused the administration of favoring political allies over seasoned military leaders. However, Pierce's leadership skills and ability to inspire loyalty among his men would soon prove his merit. Determined to serve with distinction, he joined the campaign in Mexico, where he was assigned to General Winfield Scott's army. Pierce's role in the war was both challenging and transformative. Leading a brigade during the march to Mexico City, he faced daunting terrain, intense heat, and fierce resistance from Mexican forces. Despite these hardships, Pierce demonstrated courage and determination. However, his inexperience in combat became evident during the Battle of Contreras in August 1847. Pierce suffered a severe injury after falling from his horse during a chaotic retreat. His leg was badly bruised, and he fainted from the pain, temporarily removing him from the battlefield. Critics seized on this incident to label Pierce as weak and unfit for command, but his actions in the aftermath told a different story. Despite his injury, he returned to lead his brigade during the subsequent Battle of Churubusco, refusing to let physical pain hinder his responsibilities. His dedication to his men and mission earned him their respect, even as political opponents back home continued to question his performance. The Mexican-American War proved to be a pivotal moment in Pierce's life. It solidified his reputation as a loyal Democrat willing to make personal sacrifices for the cause of national expansion. He developed a deeper understanding of leadership under extreme conditions and formed lasting bonds with fellow officers and soldiers. Among those he worked alongside was Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederate States, with whom Pierce developed a close friendship. This connection would later influence his presidency and his controversial stances during the lead-up to the Civil War. Returning home in 1848, Pierce was welcomed as a war hero in New Hampshire. The war bolstered his standing within the Democratic Party and reaffirmed his commitment to the ideals of manifest destiny. However, the conflict also deepened the nation's divisions over slavery, as new territories acquired from Mexico reignited debates over the institution's expansion. Pierce, who had largely avoided taking a strong public stance on slavery, now faced the growing challenge of navigating this contentious issue. Pierce's service in the Mexican-American War marked a turning point in his career, transitioning him from a regional leader to a figure of national importance. It highlighted both his strengths, loyalty, perseverance, and dedication, and his vulnerabilities, particularly his tendency to prioritize party unity over decisive action. These qualities, forged in the crucible of war, would shape his presidency in profound ways. Part 6. The Road to the Presidency. Franklin Pierce returned from the Mexican-American War to a hero's welcome in New Hampshire. His service as a brigadier general elevated his stature both within the Democratic Party and on the national stage. Though his military contributions were modest compared to those of other leaders, they provided him with a reputation for bravery and loyalty that resonated with voters. Pierce's deep commitment to the Democratic cause, coupled with his ability to connect with diverse constituencies, made him an increasingly attractive candidate for higher office. By the early 1850s, the Democratic Party was grappling with growing divisions over issues like slavery, states' rights, and territorial expansion. These divisions threatened to fracture the party, making the selection of a unifying candidate for the 1852 presidential election a paramount concern. The party's leading figures, such as James Buchanan, Lewis Cass, and Stephen A. Douglas, were all deeply entrenched in factional disputes. Amid this contentious backdrop, Franklin Pierce emerged as a dark horse candidate, a relatively unknown figure who could bridge the party's widening gaps. Pierce's candidacy was championed by New Hampshire Democrats and Southern leaders who appreciated his loyalty to pro-Southern policies. His support for the Compromise of 1850, which sought to balance the interests of free and slave states, positioned him as a moderate who could appeal to both Northern and Southern voters. Pierce's reputation as a war hero further bolstered his credentials, providing a compelling narrative of service and sacrifice. At the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore in June 1852, the party faced a deadlock. After 48 ballots failed to yield a decisive nominee, Pierce's name was introduced as a compromise candidate. His relative obscurity worked to his advantage, as he was untainted by the controversies that surrounded more prominent figures. On the 49th ballot, Pierce secured the nomination, with the party uniting around his candidacy as a means of preserving its fragile coalition. The Democratic platform for the 1852 election emphasized unity, manifest destiny, and adherence to the Compromise of 1850. Pierce's running mate, Senator William R. King of Alabama, was selected to balance the ticket geographically and ideologically. Together, they represented an effort to appeal to voters across the deeply divided nation. The Whig Party, the Democrats' primary opposition, nominated General Winfield Scott, a celebrated military leader under whom Pierce had served during the Mexican-American War. However, Scott's campaign struggled to overcome internal divisions within the Whig Party, particularly over the issue of slavery. Pierce, in contrast, positioned himself as a man of the people, emphasizing his humble New England roots and dedication to preserving the Union. The election of 1852 was marked by high voter turnout and intense partisan rhetoric. Pierce's message of national unity and his carefully cultivated image as a war hero resonated with voters, particularly in the South and key northern states. On Election Day, he won in a landslide, carrying 27 of the 31 states and securing a decisive victory in the Electoral College. Franklin Pierce's rise to the presidency was both unexpected and emblematic of the volatile political climate of the time. His ability to navigate party dynamics and appeal to a broad coalition of voters underscored his political acumen. However, the challenges he faced in securing the Democratic nomination foreshadowed the difficulties that would define his presidency. Pierce's victory marked the beginning of a tumultuous era, as the nation teetered on the brink of greater sectional conflict. Part 7. The Challenges of Inauguration. Franklin Pierce entered the presidency in 1853 with a strong electoral mandate, but his administration began under the shadow of personal tragedy. Just weeks before his inauguration, Pierce and his wife, Jane, experienced an unimaginable loss. Their only surviving child, 11-year-old Benny, was killed in a train accident near Andover, Massachusetts. The Pierces had been on the train when it derailed, and Benny was thrown from the carriage and fatally injured. The devastating event left Franklin and Jane deeply grief-stricken, casting a somber tone over the start of his presidency. Jane, already averse to public life, was utterly broken by the tragedy. she withdrew from social and political activities, spending much of her time in mourning and writing letters to her deceased son. Pierce, though equally heartbroken, resolved to carry on with his presidential duties, viewing his role as a solemn obligation. He later confided to friends that he believed Benny's death was a divine test of his character and leadership. This loss would remain a defining element of Pierce's presidency, influencing his decisions and further isolating him from the joys of public service. Pierce's inaugural address reflected his aspirations for his administration. Delivered on a cold, overcast March day, the speech struck a tone of optimism and determination despite his personal grief. Pierce reaffirmed his commitment to national unity and adherence to the principles of the Constitution. He pledged to uphold the Compromise of 1850, which had temporarily quelled tensions between free and slave states, and expressed his belief in the importance of territorial expansion. His address resonated with his supporters, particularly in the South, where his pro-union and pro-expansion stance was warmly received. However, the inauguration also revealed some of the challenges Pierce would face as president. His decision to swear his oath of office on a law book, rather than a Bible, sparked criticism from religious groups and traditionalists. While this choice reflected his belief in the separation of church and state, it also underscored the growing scrutiny he faced from various factions. Additionally, his lack of a clear policy agenda beyond maintaining party unity left critics questioning his preparedness for the nation's complex and escalating issues. Pierce's cabinet appointments further highlighted his commitment to party unity, but they also set the stage for future difficulties. He selected a geographically and ideologically balanced group, including prominent figures such as Secretary of State William L. Marcy and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. This approach was intended to placate the different factions within the Democratic Party, particularly Northern and Southern interests. However, it also created internal conflicts, as the diverse views within his cabinet often clashed over key policy decisions. As Pierce assumed office, the country remained deeply divided on the issue of slavery. While the Compromise of 1850 had momentarily eased tensions, it was clear that the underlying conflicts had not been resolved. The expansion of U.S. territories raised pressing questions about the future of slavery in the West, and Pierce's administration would soon find itself grappling with these contentious issues. The personal and political challenges surrounding Pierce's inauguration were a harbinger of the difficulties to come. Balancing his grief with the demands of leadership, Pierce faced a nation on the brink of sectional crisis. His presidency began with both great promise and significant obstacles, setting the stage for a tenure marked by conflict, controversy, and efforts to hold the Union together. Part 8. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Franklin Pierce's presidency is most remembered for the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a controversial piece of legislation that profoundly shaped the nation's trajectory. Introduced during his second year in office, the act sought to address the status of slavery in new territories, but instead it deepened sectional tensions and sowed discord across the country. This pivotal moment in Pierce's administration demonstrated his commitment to party loyalty, but also revealed his inability to navigate the growing divide over slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was spearheaded by Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, a prominent Democrat and advocate for westward expansion. Douglas proposed organizing the vast territories of Kansas and Nebraska to facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad and encourage settlement. However, the legislation included a provision that reignited the contentious debate over slavery. It called for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude line, and instead introduced the concept of popular sovereignty. Under this framework, settlers in each territory would vote to determine whether slavery would be permitted. Pierce, eager to support his party's agenda and maintain Southern loyalty, backed the Kansas-Nebraska Act despite its divisive implications. He viewed the legislation as a way to uphold democratic principles by allowing settlers to make decisions for themselves. Additionally, Pierce hoped the act would strengthen the Democratic Party by uniting its northern and southern factions around a shared commitment to territorial expansion. However, He underestimated the extent to which the bill would provoke outrage in the North and exacerbate regional hostilities. The Act's passage in May 1854 marked a turning point in American politics. It effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise, which had long been considered a cornerstone of sectional balance, and reopened the possibility of slavery's expansion into previously free territories. Northern abolitionists and free soilers reacted with fury, viewing the legislation as a betrayal and a capitulation to Southern interests. The resulting backlash galvanized anti-slavery forces and contributed to the formation of the Republican Party, a political movement dedicated to opposing the spread of slavery. In Kansas, the principle of popular sovereignty quickly descended into chaos. Pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded the territory, leading to violent clashes in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. The territorial elections were marred by fraud and intimidation, as pro-slavery forces from neighboring Missouri crossed the border to influence the outcome. Pierce's administration, rather than addressing the escalating violence, appeared to favor the pro-slavery government, further alienating Northern voters and tarnishing his reputation. Pierce's unwavering support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act reflected his deep commitment to party unity and his belief in the principles of self-determination. However, his failure to anticipate the Act's consequences revealed a critical weakness in his leadership. He misjudged the intensity of Northern opposition to slavery's expansion and underestimated the destabilizing impact the legislation would have on the nation. The fallout from the Kansas-Nebraska Act was profound and far-reaching. It fractured the Democratic Party, eroded Pierce's popularity, and intensified the sectional divides that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Although Pierce believed he was acting in the best interests of the country and his party, his support for the act is widely regarded as a miscalculation that accelerated the nation's descent into conflict. Part 9: Foreign Policy Initiatives. Franklin Pierce's presidency was marked not only by domestic turbulence but also by ambitious foreign policy efforts aimed at expanding U.S. influence and fulfilling the ideals of Manifest Destiny. His administration sought to extend American territorial reach, focusing on the acquisition of new lands and the assertion of dominance in the Western Hemisphere. However, these initiatives often stirred controversy, further complicating his already precarious position as president. One of the most significant foreign policy ventures of Pierce's administration was the Ostend Manifesto, a controversial document advocating for the acquisition of Cuba. The island, then a Spanish colony, was seen as a strategic and economic asset due to its proximity to the United States and its thriving sugar industry. Southern leaders, in particular, supported the acquisition, viewing it as a potential slaveholding state that could bolster their influence within the Union. In 1854, Pierce authorized American diplomats in Europe to negotiate the purchase of Cuba from Spain, offering as much as $120 million. When negotiations stalled, the diplomats Pierre Soule, James Buchanan, and John Y. Mason met in Ostend, Belgium, to discuss alternative strategies. The resulting Ostend Manifesto suggested that the United States should take Cuba by force if Spain refused to sell. When news of the manifesto leaked to the public, it provoked outrage, particularly in the North, where many saw it as a blatant attempt to expand slavery. The controversy damaged Pierce's credibility and further inflamed sectional tensions, undermining his administration's foreign policy ambitions. Another key initiative was the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, which successfully expanded U.S. territory. Pierce's administration negotiated with Mexico to acquire a strip of land in present-day southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. The purchase, finalized for $10 million, was intended to facilitate the construction of a southern transcontinental railroad and solidify U.S. control over key border regions. While the Gadsden Purchase was less controversial than the Ostend Manifesto, it nonetheless faced criticism from those who believed the funds could have been better spent addressing domestic issues. Pierce also sought to strengthen American influence in the Pacific and Asia. His administration pursued trade agreements with Japan, following the groundwork laid by Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition. The resulting Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 opened Japanese ports to American ships, marking the beginning of a new era in U.S.-Japan relations. Pierce's efforts to expand trade opportunities in the Pacific aligned with the broader goals of Manifest Destiny, reflecting his administration's focus on economic growth and global engagement. Despite these ambitions, Pierce's foreign policy achievements were overshadowed by the domestic crises that defined his presidency. His administration's inability to balance expansionist goals with the nation's growing sectional divides limited the impact of his initiatives. While the Gadsden Purchase and the Treaty of Kanagawa were seen as modest successes, the fallout from the Ostend Manifesto highlighted the risks of pursuing controversial policies in an increasingly divided nation. Pierce's foreign policy reflected his vision of a stronger, more expansive United States. However, the controversies and limitations of his efforts underscored the challenges of leadership during a time of profound internal conflict. His focus on territorial acquisition and international influence, though consistent with the era's prevailing ideologies, often deepened the divisions that threatened the Union's stability. Part 10: Bleeding Kansas and Rising Violence. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, championed during Franklin Pierce's presidency, unleashed a torrent of violence and discord in the Kansas Territory, earning the period the grim moniker Bleeding Kansas. This conflict highlighted the deep divisions within the nation and symbolized the broader sectional crisis brewing between North and South. As settlers flooded into Kansas to influence the territory's stance on slavery, the principle of popular sovereignty degenerated into bloody conflict. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces quickly clashed in a race to control the region. Pro-slavery advocates, many from neighboring Missouri, entered Kansas in large numbers, sometimes fraudulently casting ballots in territorial elections to ensure the dominance of pro-slavery legislatures. These actions led to the establishment of a pro-slavery government in Lecompton. Meanwhile, anti-slavery settlers established their own rival government in Topeka, effectively creating two opposing factions within the territory. This dual government situation became a flashpoint for conflict, with both sides vying for legitimacy and control. Pierce's administration largely supported the pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton, which many Northern critics viewed as an endorsement of the violent tactics used to secure its establishment. The president's perceived partiality alienated Northern Democrats and galvanized opposition forces, including the emerging Republican Party. Pierce's inability, or unwillingness, to mediate the conflict effectively only worsened the situation. His administration sent federal troops to maintain order but often appeared to side with pro-slavery forces, further inflaming tensions. The violence in Kansas reached horrifying levels. In 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the anti-slavery stronghold of Lawrence, Kansas, looting and burning buildings in what became known as the Sack of Lawrence. This event was a turning point in the conflict, prompting a wave of retaliatory violence from anti-slavery activists. Among the most infamous responses was the Pottawatomie Massacre, led by abolitionist John Brown. Brown and his followers brutally murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers in a nighttime raid, deepening the cycle of violence. Bleeding Kansas became a national spectacle, with newspapers and politicians on both sides using the conflict to bolster their arguments. For Northern abolitionists, the violence highlighted the moral bankruptcy of slavery and the lengths to which its supporters would go to protect the institution. For Southern leaders, the conflict was seen as proof of the North's determination to undermine their way of life and their rights under the Constitution. The media coverage of these events further polarized the nation, as both sides viewed Kansas as a symbol of the larger battle for America's future. Pierce's mishandling of the Kansas crisis damaged his reputation beyond repair. His inability to maintain peace or provide a fair resolution alienated key segments of his party and eroded public confidence in his leadership. Many Northerners saw his administration as complicit in the violence, while Southerners began to question his effectiveness in protecting their interests. The political fallout from Bleeding Kansas played a significant role in Pierce's failure to secure the Democratic nomination for a second term in 1856. The events in Kansas underscored the failure of popular sovereignty as a solution to the slavery issue. Instead of resolving the conflict, it exacerbated sectional tensions and revealed the inadequacies of Pierce's leadership. Bleeding Kansas was not only a humanitarian tragedy but also a harbinger of the Civil War, showing how deeply divided the nation had become over the question of slavery. Part 11: Political Fallout and Loss of Support. By the final years of Franklin Pierce's presidency, his political career was in steep decline. The controversies surrounding his administration, particularly his support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act and his handling of Bleeding Kansas, alienated key allies within the Democratic Party and tarnished his reputation among the American public. What had begun as a presidency of hope and ambition devolved into a struggle for relevance as the nation's sectional tensions spiraled out of control. The political fallout from the Kansas-Nebraska Act was immediate and far-reaching. Northern Democrats, many of whom had initially supported Pierce, began to abandon him in droves. The Act's repeal of the Missouri Compromise, coupled with the violence in Kansas, convinced many Northerners that Pierce's policies were advancing Southern interests at the expense of national unity. This perception fueled the growth of the Republican Party, a new political movement dedicated to opposing the expansion of slavery. Pierce found himself increasingly isolated, with his administration viewed as a symbol of the Democratic Party's inability to reconcile its divisions. The midterm elections of 1854 were a disaster for the Democratic Party. The anti-slavery backlash to the Kansas-Nebraska Act swept Republicans and anti-Nebraska Democrats into office, reshaping the political landscape. Pierce, now presiding over a fractured party, struggled to maintain control and forge a cohesive legislative agenda. His inability to appease both Northern and Southern factions left his administration paralyzed, further eroding public confidence in his leadership. Pierce's relationship with key figures in his party also began to deteriorate. Prominent Democrats, including Stephen A. Douglas, distanced themselves from his presidency, fearing that his unpopularity would damage their own political prospects. Even James Buchanan, a longtime ally and eventual successor, avoided aligning too closely with Pierce during this turbulent period. Southern Democrats, while initially supportive of Pierce, grew frustrated with his failure to fully protect their interests in the face of Northern resistance. In 1856, as the Democratic Party prepared for its national convention, it became clear that Pierce's chances of securing a second term were slim. The party, desperate to recover from the political damage of his presidency, sought a new candidate who could unify its fractured base. James Buchanan, who had served as ambassador to the United Kingdom during Pierce's tenure and thus avoided the controversies of his administration, emerged as the preferred choice. At the convention, Pierce's bid for renomination failed, marking the end of his presidential aspirations. Buchanan secured the nomination and eventually won the presidency, leaving Pierce to face the ignominy of being a one-term president rejected by his own party. The rejection stung deeply for Pierce, who had devoted his life to the Democratic Party and viewed his presidency as a service to the nation. In his farewell address, he defended his administration's policies, insisting that his actions were guided by a desire to preserve the Union and uphold the Constitution. However, his words did little to salvage his reputation, as the public remained focused on the failures and controversies that had defined his tenure. The loss of political support marked a turning point in Pierce's life, pushing him into a quieter, more reflective existence after leaving office. While he remained engaged in public affairs, his influence and legacy were irreparably diminished by the events of his presidency. Pierce's political downfall serves as a stark reminder of the perils of leadership during a time of deep national division, illustrating how even the most well-meaning efforts can falter in the face of insurmountable challenges. Part 12: Departure from Office and Reflections. Franklin Pierce left the White House in March 1857 as one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. His term had been marked by controversies, failures, and escalating sectional tensions that overshadowed any successes. As he departed Washington, D.C., Pierce expressed relief to be leaving the burdens of the presidency behind, but the rejection by his party and the nation weighed heavily on him. Pierce returned to his home in Concord, New Hampshire, seeking solace and privacy after the political turmoil of his presidency. The final years of his administration had taken a toll on his personal and professional reputation. His decision to support the Kansas-Nebraska Act and his inability to manage the violence in Kansas alienated much of the Northern public, while his failure to fully appease Southern Democrats left him with few staunch allies. The rejection by the Democratic Party at the 1856 convention was a bitter blow, reinforcing his status as a divisive and ineffective leader. Pierce spent much of his post-presidency reflecting on his years in office. He remained firm in his belief that his actions had been guided by a commitment to the Constitution and the preservation of the Union. However, he struggled to reconcile these intentions with the widespread perception that his policies had deepened the nation's divisions. His farewell address, delivered just before leaving office, underscored his sense of duty and his disappointment at the trajectory of the country. "You have summoned me in my weakness," he declared. "You must sustain me by your strength." These words hinted at his enduring hope for national unity, even as the nation seemed destined for further conflict. Pierce's personal life during this period was marked by continued struggles. His wife, Jane, who had suffered from ill health and depression throughout his presidency, remained withdrawn and grieving over the loss of their son, Benny. The couple's relationship, strained by years of tragedy and public scrutiny, grew increasingly distant. Jane's death in 1863, after a prolonged illness, left Pierce alone and deeply bereaved. His reliance on alcohol, which had been a source of concern even before his presidency, intensified during this time, further isolating him from friends and associates. Despite his retreat from public life, Pierce occasionally engaged in political discourse, often voicing criticism of his successors and the unfolding events of the Civil War. He opposed the policies of Abraham Lincoln, particularly those he viewed as infringing upon constitutional liberties, such as the suspension of habeas corpus. Pierce's criticisms, while consistent with his principles, alienated many of his contemporaries, who viewed his stances as unpatriotic during a time of national crisis. Pierce's later years were characterized by a mix of bitterness and quiet dignity. He received occasional visitors and maintained correspondence with a small circle of friends, including former political allies. Among his notable friendships was his enduring bond with Nathaniel Hawthorne, the celebrated author and fellow New Englander. Hawthorne's 1864 biography of Pierce, though widely criticized for its sympathetic portrayal, reflected the deep mutual respect between the two men. As Pierce observed the nation's descent into civil war, he could not help but feel a sense of foreboding about the future of the Union he had sought to preserve. His efforts to maintain harmony during his presidency, though often misguided, had been rooted in a sincere desire to avoid the bloodshed and destruction that ultimately came to pass. In his final years, Pierce's reflections on his presidency were a mixture of regret, resolve, and resignation, as he grappled with the legacy of his decisions and their impact on the nation. Part 13. Life after Jane's death. The death of Jane Pierce in December 1863 marked a profound turning point in Franklin Pierce's life. Already burdened by the failures of his presidency and the loss of their 3 sons, Jane's passing left Pierce utterly alone. For years, Jane had been his confidant, despite the emotional and physical challenges she faced throughout their marriage. Her death deepened Pierce's sense of isolation and accelerated his retreat from public life. Jane's funeral was a modest affair, reflecting her reserved nature and the somber tone of their marriage. Pierce, visibly grief-stricken, mourned in solitude, avoiding the attention of the public and press. Following her burial in Concord, New Hampshire, he returned to their family home, which now felt empty and devoid of purpose. This period of Pierce's life was marked by reflection, sorrow, and a growing reliance on alcohol as he attempted to cope with his overwhelming sense of loss. Pierce's drinking, which had been a subject of quiet concern during his presidency, worsened significantly after Jane's death. In the absence of familial companionship and political engagement, he turned increasingly to alcohol for comfort. Friends and acquaintances noted his decline, with some expressing pity for the former president's lonely and troubled state. Despite offers of support from his remaining allies, Pierce largely kept to himself, preferring the solitude of his home and occasional trips to the local countryside. During this period, Pierce's correspondence with Nathaniel Hawthorne provided a rare source of solace. The two men had been close friends for decades, sharing a deep mutual respect and understanding of one another's struggles. Hawthorne, though ill himself, remained a loyal confidant, often writing letters that encouraged Pierce to find meaning beyond his personal tragedies. When Hawthorne died in 1864, the loss was another devastating blow to Pierce, who felt increasingly untethered from the world around him. Despite his declining health and emotional state, Pierce occasionally re-emerged to comment on political matters, particularly as the Civil War raged on. A staunch defender of states' rights and constitutional principles, he criticized President Abraham Lincoln's wartime measures, including the suspension of habeas corpus and the Emancipation Proclamation. Pierce's opposition to Lincoln, while rooted in his belief in limited government, earned him the ire of many Northerners, who viewed his remarks as disloyal during a time of national crisis. Pierce's criticisms of the Union's war efforts isolated him further from his contemporaries. Many former political allies distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with his controversial views. Yet Pierce remained steadfast, convinced that his opposition was principled and necessary. He viewed the war's toll on civil liberties and the centralization of power as threats to the ideals of the Constitution. These views, though deeply unpopular, reflected his lifelong commitment to a vision of governance that prioritized balance and restraint. In his final years, Pierce focused on preserving what remained of his personal dignity and legacy. He rarely sought public attention and rejected opportunities to write memoirs or participate in political reunions. When asked to reflect on his presidency, he often deflected, insisting that history would judge his actions in due time. Pierce's humility and introspection in these later years stood in stark contrast to the turmoil of his earlier career, as he sought to come to terms with the consequences of his decisions and the path his life had taken. By the time of his death in 1869, Franklin Pierce had become a tragic figure in American history. The cumulative weight of personal losses and public disapproval had left him a man marked by sadness and regret. Yet, in his own quiet way, Pierce remained resolute, determined to live out his remaining days with the dignity he could muster. His life after Jane's death was one of profound grief, but also of a stoic endurance that underscored the complexities of his character. Part 14: Franklin Pierce's Final Years. As the 1860s drew to a close, Franklin Pierce's life was a shadow of its earlier prominence. The former president, once a leading figure in American politics, now lived in relative obscurity in Concord, New Hampshire. The death of his wife, Jane, in 1863, and the compounded loss of his children and closest friends, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, had left him profoundly lonely. Pierce's final years were marked by a struggle to find meaning amidst personal and public disillusionment. Pierce rarely ventured into public life during these years, preferring solitude over the scrutiny that had defined much of his political career. He spent his days reading, reflecting, and corresponding with the few remaining friends who had not abandoned him due to his controversial views during the Civil War. He remained a staunch critic of President Abraham Lincoln's policies, particularly those he believed infringed upon constitutional liberties. Pierce's critiques of wartime measures, including the suspension of habeas corpus and the growing power of the federal government, alienated him from many in the North, who saw such dissent as unpatriotic. Despite his political isolation, Pierce refused to compromise his principles. He believed deeply in the values of the Constitution, and viewed the Union's trajectory during the war as a betrayal of the nation's founding ideals. However, his stance made him a target of harsh criticism, with some accusing him of sympathizing with the Confederacy. Pierce vehemently denied such accusations, insisting that his opposition stemmed from a desire to protect civil liberties and prevent the overreach of federal power. Yet his nuanced position was often misunderstood, leaving him further estranged from the political mainstream. Pierce's health began to decline significantly in his later years. His reliance on alcohol, which had intensified after Jane's death, contributed to chronic health issues that weakened his body and spirit. Friends who visited him during this time remarked on his deteriorating physical condition and the visible toll of years of sorrow and regret. While Pierce tried to maintain a dignified presence, his declining health was an ever-present reminder of his struggles. One of the few bright moments in Pierce's later years came through his involvement in local charitable efforts. Though no longer in a position of national influence, he sought ways to contribute to his community in Concord. Pierce supported initiatives to aid widows and orphans of Civil War soldiers, recognizing the profound human cost of the conflict. These acts of quiet generosity revealed a man still committed to the well-being of others, even as he wrestled with his own burdens. In October 1869, Franklin Pierce's life came to an end. He passed away at the age of 64, succumbing to cirrhosis of the liver exacerbated by years of heavy drinking. His death was a subdued affair, with limited public mourning beyond his home state of New Hampshire. Pierce's funeral reflected his humble wishes, avoiding grand displays of ceremony. He was laid to rest beside his wife and children in Concord's Old North Cemetery, completing the final chapter of a life marked by triumph, tragedy, and complexity. Pierce's legacy remains one of the most debated in American history. While his presidency is often criticized for its failures in addressing sectional divisions and his controversial support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, his personal story adds depth to the understanding of his character. Pierce's later years, filled with reflection and quiet acts of kindness, suggest a man who sought redemption in the face of his shortcomings. Though history has often judged him harshly, the complexities of his life and leadership invite a more nuanced appraisal. Part 15. Legacy and Reflection on Franklin Pierce's Presidency. Franklin Pierce's presidency is often remembered as one of the most divisive and troubled in American history. His time in office from 1853 to 1857 was marked by failed compromises, sectional conflict, and a growing rift between North and South. Despite his best intentions, Pierce's policies, especially the Kansas-Nebraska Act, only intensified the national divisions that ultimately led to the Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Pierce championed, was meant to settle the debate over slavery's expansion by allowing settlers in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide the issue through popular sovereignty. Instead, it reignited the bitter dispute over slavery in the territories and led to violent clashes in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas. Pierce's support for the act and his handling of the ensuing violence alienated many Northerners, while his failure to fully appease Southern interests diminished his standing among Southern Democrats. Perhaps Pierce's most enduring legacy is his failure to address the slavery issue in a manner that could have preserved the Union. Instead of navigating the nation through its growing crisis, he exacerbated tensions by endorsing the idea that the expansion of slavery was a matter of local choice, rather than a moral and political question for the nation to address as a whole. His inability to forge meaningful compromises and his reluctance to confront the implications of slavery's expansion helped create the conditions for the Civil War. Yet, Pierce's presidency is not without complexity. While many historians criticize his leadership, it is important to recognize that he was genuinely committed to preserving the Union. His actions, though misguided, were driven by a belief in maintaining constitutional principles and ensuring national stability in a time of deepening sectionalism. However, his inability to understand the deeper moral and political dimensions of the slavery issue led him down a path of failure. In the years following his presidency, Pierce remained largely out of the public eye, content to reflect on his life and the tumultuous years of his administration. His post-presidency was marked by personal loss, isolation, and a continued sense of regret for his inability to keep the nation together. Pierce's quiet existence in Concord was far removed from the public attention that once defined his life, yet his contemplations offer a glimpse into the inner turmoil he felt over the political battles he fought. Franklin Pierce's legacy has evolved over time, with historians revisiting his presidency as the causes of the Civil War have become better understood. Initially, he was seen as a failed president who had only worsened the sectional crisis, but more recent scholarship has sought to place his actions in a broader context, recognizing the pressures he faced as president during an era of intense political and social upheaval. While his presidency ended in failure, Pierce's story highlights the personal and political complexities of leading during one of America's most difficult moments. In the end, Franklin Pierce remains a tragic figure in American history. His presidency marked by good intentions undone by missteps and miscalculations. His struggles to preserve the Union, though ultimately unsuccessful, reflect the challenges faced by many leaders of the time, who found themselves caught between the competing forces of a nation on the brink of collapse. While history has often judged him harshly, there is a growing recognition of the human side of his story, a man who grappled with the weight of his decisions, the loss of his family, and the eventual disintegration of the Union he had tried to protect. This final reflection on Pierce's legacy reminds us that history is often more complex than the simple narrative of success or failure, and that every leader's story is marked by both triumph and tragedy. This concludes the documentary on Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States. Thank you for your attention to his story, one of ambition, conflict, and reflection during a pivotal moment in American history. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.